Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 32, Section 2, and Part 2 of the Middle East Unit. And we are going to continue where we left off, and we're going to talk a little bit about Iran. Iran is a nation that is in the Middle East that has a fairly large oil industry. And in the time since really the end of World War One, Iran had been ruled by a Shah, which was like an emperor. Um, when World War II came around, we saw, Iran for the most part trying to support the Allies, but with the rise of the Cold War, there was a lot of concern about Iran's neighbor, primarily the Soviet Union. And this is where we kind of begin here. In 1951, the Iranian prime minister named Mossadegh. Um, he helped nationalize the Iraq or Iranian oil industry, meaning that he was putting the oil industry back in the hands of the Iranian people. But he had ties to the Soviet Union, and hence the United States and Great Britain had called for a boycott of Iranian oil, supported a coup d'etat, which is like a overthrow of the government to oust Mossadegh from power. And when he's ousted from power, the emperor or the Shah, obviously, is going to have kind of a power grab. He's going to become a little more powerful. And as a result, he's going to use his secret police to spy, intimidate, and torture his opposition. The thing about that is, the United States supported the Shah primarily because he was an anti communist. But at the same time, some people within Iran didn't like the Shah because he was a man wanting to do a lot of modern reforms, and he was moving the nation of Iran away from traditional Islamic values. The fact that women didn't have to wear veils was a big issue for a lot of folks. And hence, there are going to be people who are going to try to find ways to bring back the traditional values within that country. So fast forward to 1978. Many of the Iranians are upset with the Shah. He's kind of a thug. He's got cronies in the United States and all over Europe, and they're kind of turning to this man named the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was an Islamic cleric, and he inspired many of these Iranians who were being oppressed to turn back to Islam and to rise up and to unite. And by 1979, the Shah, facing a lot of opposition, fled Iran. Now, he might have fled for a couple different reasons, aside from the fact that he wasn't very popular. He also had a health issue. He was dying of cancer. And as a result, he is going to be trying to find a way to get into some type of medical treatment. Matter of fact, he wants to come to the United States, and we keep turning him down as we know that the fact that he's not very popular, and we didn't want to be associated with him. But needless to say, once he leaves, Iran becomes an Islamic republic. And later on in 1979, Iranian revolutionaries who are upset with the United States for our ties with the Shah and the fact that at some point in time we're going to allow the Shah to come into our country to receive medical treatment for his cancer, seized our American embassy in the capital of Tehran. And they took roughly 66 Americans hostage. And these hostages were held until from starting in late autumn of 1979 until January of 1981. It was a very trying time. And it was very difficult to for Americans to watch the news to see Iranians burning American flags and making all sorts of um, protest against the United States. Fast forward to 1990, and Iran's neighbor Iraq. The man that you see pictured on the throne below is Saddam Hussein, and he decides that he's going to invade his neighbor Kuwait. Kuwait is a little country on the Persian Gulf. Its neighbors are Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And what's weird is there's an oil field that kind of lies right under Kuwait and a little bit of Iraq and a little bit of Saudi Arabia. And the Kuwaitis had made a lot of money drilling oil. And matter of fact, Saddam Hussein was a little jealous of that. And so he accused the Kuwaitis of drilling into the Iraqi oil field and stealing oil from Iraq. Hence, since Kuwait was such a small nation, not very populated, Saddam had a big military, and so he invades. The United States was concerned, and we felt like our oil supplies in Kuwait and its neighbor Saudi Arabia were threatened, and they called upon the United Nations to pass economic sanctions against Iraq, like freezing all the bank accounts that the Iraqi government might have outside of its country. So if they had money in American banks, they wouldn't be able to withdraw that, and so forth. But that alone wasn't enough to get Saddam to withdraw his troops. And thus, the United States led a coalition that launched the Persian Gulf War. And this coalition was made up of um, kind of a multinational UN force, meaning that countries that belong to the United Nations sent troops, and some of them were trained with the American troops in Saudi Arabia in the fall of 1990. But these troops invaded Kuwait in February of 1991. And within a very short period of time, we're talking within about a month, the Iraqi forces were pushed out of Kuwait. Thus, Kuwait was liberated, which was really the sole, I guess you could say, goal of this military event. Iraqi forces were eventually pushed within their Iraqi borders. And in the process of trying to flee Kuwait, one of the things that they did is they set many of the oil wells on fire, and they created one of the biggest man-made environmental disasters ever known. Um, but that wasn't the only issue. There was a lot of concern that Iraq might be in possession of chemical and biological weapons, and that was further prompted by an event that happened in about 1992 when it was found out that Iraq had used biological weapons against its own people. A group of Iraqi Kurds, who were a minority group within that country, were gassed and causing the death of many of those people. And so the United Nations wanted to call upon arms inspectors to go in and investigate to see whether or not Saddam Hussein had biological or chemical weapons, or as they would call them, weapons of mass destruction. Well, um, Saddam failed to cooperate with these arms inspectors, and thus the UN was in a position where they had to figure out if they needed to, you know, put out more sanctions against the Iraqi government and whatnot. In 1993, there was also some Islamic terrorist attacks. A lot of these were actually tied to the group Al Qaeda. The first one is probably one that a lot of people don't realize. You know, there were two attacks on the World Trade Center, probably the most famous happening on 9/11. But the attack that happened in 1993 is one that a lot of people don't remember. And it was actually a truck bomb that was parked underneath the World Trade Center in a parking garage. It went off and it caused a fire and some damage, but it didn't bring down the Twin Towers. In 1998, the United States embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were also targeted by car bombs and such. But it's the attack that happened on September 11th, 2001, that targeted not only the World Trade Center in New York and also the Pentagon. That is the one that most people remember. On that attack, over 3,000 people died. To put it in perspective, that's more than the number of soldiers that were killed during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. So it was obviously a very large scale event, and hence the United States is going to want to, you know, take care of this. And so in the fall of 2001, our government responded to these attacks by launching an attack on Afghanistan, primarily targeting Al Qaeda, but also an organization known as the Taliban. Taliban had actually been ruling and governing Afghanistan for a number of years, but they were a very strict group. They had a lot of rules, especially rules that limited the rights and freedom of women and children. Uh, the Taliban also had been known to work with Al Qaeda and had been training some of its terrorists. And the Taliban had ruled Afghanistan, and they were supported and protected members of Al Qaeda, including one of its biggest, I guess you could say, uh, funders, because Osama bin Laden was a very wealthy man and he funded a lot of Al Qaeda out of his own pocket. So these are going to be our primary targets when we start sending troops into Afghanistan. Unfortunately, Osama bin Laden is going to be very difficult to find. When we talk about the territory that the Taliban had, if you look at the maps here, those areas that are kind of in the kind of the green apple green are territories that were controlled by the Taliban. So they had a pretty large area starting in 1996 and throughout the beginning of 2001. But as American troops come in, that area is going to be diminished. And you see this area down at the bottom of the map named Kandahar. It was believed that that's where Osama bin Laden was hiding, but truth be it, he actually was not always in Afghanistan. He actually had crossed the border into Pakistan. And so in May of 2011, President Barack Obama had announced that the United States had a victory against Al Qaeda when Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden in his hideout in Pakistan. Literally, he was hiding in plain sight in this uh, kind of fortified compound he actually had built after 9/11, spent millions of dollars to do so. And, with maybe the help of the CIA, we figured out where he was at and we're able to do an ambush. And certainly that was considered to be, a pretty big moment for this war on terror. Following the 9/11 attacks, some U.S. leaders thought that Saddam Hussein posed a greater threat to the United States, and many worried that he might have these weapons of mass destruction. Sometimes this is known by the acronym of WMD. Um, and the fact that, Saddam had used gas warfare against the Kurds in his own country uh, probably, was a pretty reasonable belief that he did have these weapons. So in March of 2003, the U.S. launches invasion against Iraq. A lot of people call this unfinished business, but it was believed that Saddam had possession of these chemical weapons and biological weapons and had supported anti American terroristic organizations like Al Qaeda. The military quickly toppled the Iraqi government, but we didn't find weapons. And matter of fact, uh, we couldn't find any biological and chemical weapons. So we don't know if they were there or if they got hidden or whatnot. But as American troops are coming in, Saddam flees. And we lose track of him for a while until he is found, literally hiding in a hole in the ground. You can see the photographs there to the right. Saddam was looking pretty ragged when he was found. All right, thank you very much.